They made her kneel for bread, and by sunrise the man who laughed the loudest would forget how to stand straight. The bell above the shop door gave a tired ring as Eliza May Carter stepped inside, dust clinging to the hem of her dress, the smell of flour and smoked meat hanging thick in the air. She kept her eyes low, not out of shame, but because she had learned that in this town, looking too long meant inviting judgment. Thomas Whitaker stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled, fingers counting coins that never seemed to leave his side, and when he saw her, his mouth curled just enough to be noticed. "Back again?" he said, voice smooth but edged like a dull blade. Eliza placed 3 worn coins on the counter, each one pressed flat from years of passing through hands that worked harder than his ever had. "Just bread," she said, quiet, steady. Whitaker didn't reach for the coins. Instead, he flicked one with his finger, sending it spinning off the counter, hitting the wooden floor with a sharp, echoing click. Then another. Then the last. The sound drew eyes. A couple of men by the window paused mid-conversation, watching without speaking. Whitaker leaned forward slightly, resting his palms on the counter like he had all the time in the world. "If you want it," he said, "you pick it up proper." Eliza didn't move at first. The room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls had leaned in just to see what she would do. Then slowly, she lowered herself to her knees, the rough wood biting through the thin fabric beneath her, her fingers reaching for the coins one by one. No one laughed out loud. Not quite. But the silence carried something worse. She gathered them carefully, stood back up, and placed them again on the counter, her hands no longer shaking. Whitaker watched her a moment longer than necessary, then slid a loaf toward her like it was an afterthought. Outside, through the dusty glass, a figure stood near the hitching post, still as a shadow that refused to move with the wind. Eliza stepped back into the sunlight, the brightness catching her eyes for a second, and as she adjusted, she saw him. A man in worn clothes, dust-covered boots, watching the street like he wasn't part of it. She hesitated, then broke the loaf in half without thinking, the crust cracking softly in her hands. She walked over and held out the larger piece. "You look like you could use it more," she said. The man didn't reach right away. His eyes, dark and steady, studied her like he was weighing something far heavier than bread. Then slowly he took it. "No thanks." No words. Just a nod, almost too small to notice. Eliza turned and walked away, unaware that from the corner of the street, 2 riders had already begun to slow, their gaze fixed not on the shop, not on the town, but on the man she had just helped, and the single, quiet act that would not be forgotten by morning. The town did not speak of what happened inside Whitaker's shop, but it carried the weight of it the way dust carries the memory of hooves long after the riders are gone. By late afternoon, the sun hung low and heavy, stretching shadows across the main street, and Eliza May Carter walked with half a loaf wrapped in cloth, her steps measured, her back straight, as if nothing had been taken from her at all. People noticed. They always did. A woman drawing water paused just long enough to watch her pass. A man fixing a wagon wheel wiped his hands slower than needed, but no one said a word, because silence in a place like this was not absence, it was agreement. Near the edge of town, where the road thinned into open land and the wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant hills, the man she had helped earlier still stood, though now he was no longer alone. One horse. Then another. Then a third, each rider arriving without hurry, without sound beyond the soft rhythm of hoofs pressing into dirt. They did not gather close. They did not speak. They simply waited, their eyes moving between the man and the road Eliza had taken, as if measuring something unseen. The man broke the bread she had given him, not eating it right away, but holding it for a moment, feeling its weight like it was more than food, like it carried something that could not be bought inside any store. Back in town, Whitaker closed his shop later than usual, his hands slower on the latch, his gaze drifting once or twice toward the street where the light had begun to fade. He told himself it was nothing. Just another girl. Just another day. Yet the coins she had placed on the counter had felt different under his fingers, worn smooth not by use, but by endurance. He had noticed that, though he did not know why. As night settled, the town quieted in the way it always did, lanterns flickering behind thin curtains, the sound of distant wind brushing against wood and glass. But something beneath that quiet shifted, subtle and steady, like the earth itself had decided to hold its breath. Out beyond the last fence line, more riders appeared, not in a rush, not in chaos, but in a slow, deliberate line that stretched farther than the eye could follow, their silhouettes blending into the dark like they had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be seen. No one in town marked the exact hour they arrived, but a dog that barked every night fell silent, and a porch door that always creaked did not move, and somewhere in that stillness, the weight of a single act, a broken loaf shared without hesitation, began to gather into something larger than any one person could understand. And by the time the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the road leading back to Whitaker's shop was no longer empty. The first light of morning did not arrive with warmth, it arrived with stillness, the kind that settles over a place when something unseen has already taken its position, and as the sun pushed slowly over the horizon, the road that led to Whitaker's shop revealed shapes that had not been there the night before, riders spaced with quiet precision, horses standing calm as stone, their breath visible in the cool air like soft clouds that rose and vanished without sound. No one announced their presence. No one needed to. A farmer stepping out to tend his field stopped halfway through his gate, his hand resting on the wood as his eyes fixed on the line of figures stretching farther than he could count. A woman lifting water from the well forgot the bucket in her hands as it dipped too deep, the ropes slipping slightly as she stared. Even the wind seemed to pull back, as if it understood that movement now belonged to something else. At the center of it all stood the man Eliza had helped, no longer alone, no longer unnoticed, his posture unchanged, but the space around him different, filled with a quiet authority that did not need to be declared. He held nothing in his hands now, not the bread, not the coin, only the memory of both, and somehow that was enough. Whitaker opened his shop as he always did, the same routine, the same turn of the key, the same creak of the door as it swung inward. But the moment he stepped outside, he felt it, not fear, not yet, but a pressure, like the air had grown heavier overnight. His eyes lifted, slowly at first, then faster as they took in the riders, the number of them, the way they stood without shifting, without speaking, as if they had been placed there by something older than the town itself. He straightened his coat, a reflex more than a decision, and stepped forward, trying to measure what stood before him in terms he understood, numbers, distance, control, but none of it fit. One rider moved then, just one, guiding his horse a few steps ahead of the others, not in challenge, not in threat, but in quiet intention. The man from yesterday stepped beside him, and for the first time, Whitaker recognized him, not by name, not by face, but by the absence he had carried the day before, the way he had been overlooked so easily. That absence was gone now. In its place stood something steady, something that did not bend. Behind them, more riders became visible as the light grew stronger, not rushing forward, not closing in, just being seen, row after row, a presence that did not need to move to be understood. Inside the shop, the shelves of goods, the sacks of flour, the jars lined in neat order suddenly felt smaller, like they belonged to a different world, one where value was counted in coins and measured in ounces, not in the weight of a single choice made without witness. Whitaker's gaze dropped, just for a moment, to the counter where coins usually rested, and though there was nothing there now, he could almost hear the faint echo of one striking wood, sharp and clear, a sound that seemed to carry further this morning than it ever had before, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to be understood. Whitaker did not step back, not at first, because men like him were built on the belief that everything could be measured, weighed, and eventually controlled. But the longer he stood there, the more that belief began to thin, like fabric worn too many seasons under a harsh sun. The riders did not move closer. They did not reach for anything. They simply remained, their stillness carrying more weight than any threat ever could, and that was what unsettled him most, the absence of demand, the lack of noise, the way the entire street seemed to belong to them without a single word spoken. A few townspeople gathered at a distance, not daring to come too near, their whispers low and uncertain, because no one could recall a moment like this, where presence alone had rewritten the balance of a place overnight. The man Eliza had helped step forward just enough to be seen clearly in the morning light, his face no longer hidden beneath dust and shadow, his posture calm, grounded, like someone who did not need to prove anything to anyone standing before him. In his hand now was a single coin, the same one Eliza had pressed into his palm the day before, its surface worn smooth, edges softened by time, yet it seemed to carry more meaning now than all the silver Whitaker kept locked behind his counter. He walked the few steps to the shop door, not hurried, not slow, and placed the coin down on the wood with a soft, deliberate sound that echoed farther than it should have, as if the entire town had been waiting to hear it. Whitaker's eyes dropped to it, drawn without permission, and for a moment, he saw not a coin, but a reflection, faint and distorted, of the man he had been standing just hours earlier, confident, amused, certain of his place in the world. When he looked up again, the man was already stepping back, returning to the line without turning his back, without breaking the quiet that had settled over everything. Then another rider moved forward, older, his presence marked not by force, but by a kind of gravity that shifted the air around him. He dismounted slowly, boots touching the ground with care, and walked to the same spot, his gaze steady on Whitaker, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more difficult to face, understanding. He did not speak right away. He simply stood there, letting the silence stretch, letting Whitaker feel the weight of it, until even the smallest sound, the creak of a sign, the distant call of a bird, seemed too loud for the moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, even, carrying no threat, only truth. "In our land," he said, "a man is known by what he does when no one is watching." The words settled into the space between them, not as judgment, but as something that could not be argued with, something that did not need to be enforced. Whitaker opened his mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to defend, but the words did not come, because for the first time, he was not being asked for anything, not being challenged, not being forced, he was simply being seen, and that, more than anything, left him without ground to stand on. The words did not echo, yet they lingered, settling into the wood, the dust, the very breath of the town, and Whitaker felt them not in his ears, but somewhere deeper, somewhere he had not visited in years. No one moved. Not the riders, not the people watching from doorways and windows, not even the loose sign above the shop that usually swayed with the morning breeze. It hung still, as if the world itself had paused to see what he would do next. Whitaker's fingers twitched at his sides, a small, uncertain motion, the kind a man makes when the habits he has relied on no longer fit the moment. His eyes dropped again to the coin resting on the counter, and this time he noticed details he had missed before, the faint scratch along one edge, the way the surface had been smoothed not by wealth, but by years of survival, passed from hand to hand where every cent mattered. It was not valuable in the way he understood value, yet it had drawn more attention, more presence, than anything he had ever sold. Across the street, a boy who often lingered near the shop shifted his weight, looking from Whitaker to the riders, then back again, as if trying to understand how a single moment from the day before had grown into something this large, this undeniable. Whitaker cleared his throat. The sound dry, unfamiliar, and stepped forward half a pace, but even that felt like stepping into a space that no longer belonged to him. He looked at the older man who had spoken, searching for something to hold on to, a challenge, an accusation, anything that would allow him to respond the way he always had, but there was none. Only calm. Only certainty. The kind that did not need to raise its voice. The kind that could not be dismissed. Behind them, the line of riders remained unchanged, stretching along the road like a quiet horizon, each one present, each one watching, yet none of them pressing forward, none of them demanding anything at all. That absence began to press in on Whitaker more than any threat could have. He had spent his life dealing in exchanges, in clear terms, in transactions where one thing was given and another taken, but here, there was nothing to trade, nothing to negotiate, only a reflection of what he had already done. His gaze shifted, almost against his will, down the street, following the path Eliza had taken the day before, and for a brief moment, he saw her again in his mind, kneeling on the floor, gathering coins that he had scattered, not out of need, but out of something smaller, something he had never named. The memory did not sit right anymore. It did not feel like control. It did not feel like power. It felt exposed. A murmur moved through the small crowd now, not loud, not chaotic, just a ripple of awareness, as if the town itself was beginning to understand that what stood before them was not about punishment, not about force, but about something far harder to escape, the quiet, steady presence of consequence. Whitaker reached out then, slowly, his fingers closing around the coin, and for the first time, it did not feel light in his hand. It felt heavy, as if it carried more than metal, more than weight, as if it held the measure of a moment he could not undo, no matter how tightly he held it. Whitaker held the coin longer than necessary, his fingers pressing into its edges as if he could feel something hidden beneath the worn metal, something that might explain why this moment had grown larger than anything he had ever faced behind his counter. The riders did not react. They did not shift or whisper or exchange glances. They simply remained, their stillness turning the morning into something dense and unyielding. The older man watched him without urgency, as though time itself had slowed to match the weight of the choice now resting in Whitaker's hand. Across the street, more townspeople had gathered, drawn not by noise, but by the absence of it, by the way the usual rhythm of mourning had been replaced with something quieter, something that asked for attention without demanding it. A woman clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the air was not cold, and a man who prided himself on speaking his mind found that he had nothing to say at all. Whitaker's gaze lifted again, moving from the coin to the man before him, then past him to the line of riders stretching down the road, each one a reminder that this was no small misunderstanding, no passing moment that could be dismissed or forgotten by afternoon. And yet, no one had asked him for anything. No one had told him what to do. That was what unsettled him most. There was no instruction, no demand, no price he could pay to make this end quickly. Only the quiet expectation that he would understand on his own. He looked back down at the coin and for the first time, he remembered the exact moment it had fallen to the floor, the sharp sound it made as it struck the wood, the way Eliza had lowered herself without protest, gathering what little she had with hands that did not accuse him, did not resist him, did not even question him. She had simply done it. Not because she accepted what he had done, but because she had something else to hold on to, something he had not seen then. Something he could not ignore now. Whitaker exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it should have, and his shoulders lowered just enough to be noticed by no one but himself. The coin shifted in his grip, and with it, something inside him gave way, not loudly, not suddenly, but like a door that had been closed for too long finally opening just enough to let light in. He stepped back, just one step, creating space between himself and the counter that had always defined him, and turned. Slightly, his eyes moving toward the shelves behind him, the sacks of flour, the rows of goods, all the things he had measured his worth against for years. They looked different now. Smaller. Lighter. Not because they had changed, but because something else had taken their place. When he turned back, the older man had not moved, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, not approval, not satisfaction, just recognition, as if he had seen this moment before in other places, other towns, where men had been forced to face themselves without distraction. Whitaker opened his hand then, slowly, and placed the coin back on the counter, not as a transaction, not as a return, but as something closer to acknowledgement. The sound it made was soft, almost lost in the quiet, but it carried, just enough for those watching to hear it, just enough for the moment to settle into something real. And for the first time since the riders had arrived, Whitaker did not look at them for answers. He looked at the empty space in front of him, as if he finally understood that what came next would not be decided by anyone else. For a long moment, nothing happened, and in that stillness, the entire town seemed to lean forward without moving, waiting for something that no one could name but everyone could feel. Whitaker stood behind his counter, the coin resting where he had placed it, no longer hidden in his hand, no longer something he could ignore, and for the first time in years, he looked past it, past the wood and the shelves and the doorway, to the street beyond, where the riders remained, silent as the land itself. The older man gave the smallest nod, not as approval, not as command, but as acknowledgement that something had shifted, something quiet and irreversible. Then he turned, slow and deliberate, and stepped back toward his horse, his presence folding into the line once more as if he had never stepped out at all. One by one, the riders began to move, not all at once, not in any hurried fashion, but in a steady, measured rhythm, turning their horses away from the town, their silhouettes shifting against the morning light as they began to leave the same way they had come, without a sound, without a demand, without taking anything with them, except what had already been given. The man Eliza had helped was the last to turn, his gaze lingering on Whitaker for just a moment longer, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something deeper, something that asked no questions and offered no answers. Then he, too, guided his horse away, following the others down the road until the line of riders became smaller, then distant, then part of the land again, as if they had never been separate from it at all. The town did not move right away. No one rushed forward. No one spoke. It was as if the silence they had brought remained behind, settling into the spaces between buildings, into the pauses between breaths, into the place where words would have been if anyone had dared to use them. Whitaker remained where he was, his hands resting lightly on the counter, his eyes fixed on the empty road long after the last rider had disappeared from sight. The absence they left behind felt heavier than their presence had been, because now there was nothing to stand against, nothing to distract from what had been revealed. Slowly, the town began to breathe again. A door opened somewhere. A wagon creaked as it rolled forward. Voices returned, low at first, then slightly louder, but none of them carried the same certainty they had the day before. Across the street, the boy who had been watching stepped closer, his eyes moving from the road to Whitaker, then to the coins still resting on the counter, as if trying to understand how something so small could have drawn so much into motion. Whitaker finally looked down at it again, but this time, there was no calculation in his gaze, no measure of worth, no quiet dismissal. Only recognition. He reached for it once more, but instead of closing his hand around it, he left his fingers resting lightly against its surface, as if he understood now that some things were not meant to be taken, only understood. And somewhere beyond the edge of town, where the road curved out of sight, the dust settled slowly back to the ground, carrying with it the last trace of a moment that had asked for nothing, and yet had taken everything that mattered. By midday, the town tried to return to itself, but something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not by routine, not by habit, not even by time. Whitaker stood behind his counter longer than usual, not serving, not counting, just standing, as if the space he had known all his life no longer fit the man inside it. The coin remained where he had left it, untouched, catching light from the doorway in a way that made it seem almost out of place among the neat rows of goods and polished surfaces. Customers came, slowly at first, then in small groups, each one stepping inside with a glance that lingered just a moment too long, their voices quieter, their movements more careful, as if they were entering not just a store, but a memory still settling into place. No one mentioned the riders. No one needed to. It was there, in the way they placed their money, in the way they avoided looking directly at Whitaker, in the way they left a little quicker than usual. Across town, Eliza May Carter sat on the edge of a worn wooden step outside her small cabin, the remaining half of the bread resting beside her, untouched. The morning had passed like any other for her, chores done, water carried, the quiet rhythm of survival continuing without interruption, yet there had been a moment, just before sunrise, when she had paused without knowing why, a stillness settling around her that felt unfamiliar, like the world had held its breath somewhere beyond her sight. She had shaken it off, the way people do when they cannot explain something, and continued on, unaware of what had unfolded in her name. Back at the shop, Whitaker finally reached for the coin again, lifting it slowly, turning it between his fingers, not as a merchant this time, but as a man trying to understand the weight of something that had never been meant to be sold. He stepped out from behind the counter, something he rarely did, and walked toward the doorway, each step measured, uncertain in a way that would have seemed impossible just a day before. Outside, the street looked the same, dust drifting in thin lines across the ground, sunlight stretching along the buildings. But the feeling beneath it had changed, quieter, deeper, like the town had learned something it could not yet speak. He looked down the road where the riders had disappeared, then further, toward the edge of town where the land opened wide and empty, and for the first time, he realized how small his world had been, contained within walls and transactions, defined by things that now felt distant. His gaze shifted again, this time toward the path that led to the outskirts, to the place where those with less built what they could from what remained. He stood there for a long moment, the coin resting in his palm, before closing his fingers around it, not tightly, not possessively, but with care, as if it no longer belonged to him in the way it once might have. Then, without announcement, without drawing attention, he stepped off the wooden threshold of his shop and into the street, turning in the direction he had rarely walked, his pace steady, his posture no longer rigid, but something quieter, something closer to understanding. And behind him, the door to the shop remained open, the counter empty, the space he had once controlled left behind, not abandoned, but no longer enough. The road out of town had always been there, stretching past the last fence, past the last roof, into a place where things were not measured in coins or counted in ledgers, and Whitaker walked it now with a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, each step carrying the quiet weight of something newly understood. The dust rose beneath his boots in soft clouds, settling again just as quickly, as if the land itself was willing to let him pass without question. He did not look back. Not at the shop, not at the street, not at the place where he had stood so certain of himself just hours before. Ahead, the small line of cabins came into view, weathered wood, uneven fences, the kind of place most in town pretended not to see unless they had reason to. Eliza May Carter sat where she had been, the bread still beside her, her hands resting loosely in her lap as she watched the quiet stretch of land in front of her, unaware that the morning had already rewritten something in her name. She noticed him only when his shadow reached the edge of the step, long and unfamiliar, and when she looked up, her expression did not change much, just a slight narrowing of her eyes, the natural caution of someone who had learned that kindness was not always returned. Whitaker stopped a few feet away, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to pretend distance, and for a moment, he said nothing, because the words he had used all his life no longer felt like they belonged to this moment. He opened his hand slowly, the coin resting in his palm, catching the light just enough to show its worn surface, its edges softened by time. "This was never mine," he said, his voice lower than it had been that morning, not weaker, just different, stripped of something that had once filled it. Eliza looked at the coin, then at him, her gaze steady, searching not for apology, not for explanation, but for something simpler, something real. He stepped forward just enough to place the coin on the step beside her, not pressing it into her hand, not forcing it back, just leaving it where it could be seen, where it could exist without being claimed. "I saw it too late," he added, and there was no defense in the words, no attempt to soften what had already been done. Only truth, plain and unadorned. The wind moved lightly across the open land, brushing against the edges of the cabin, carrying with it the quiet sounds of a world that continued whether men understood it or not. Eliza's eyes shifted from the coin back to him, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with something that did not need to be named. Then, slowly, she reached for the bread, broke off a small piece, and set it beside the coin, not as payment, not as forgiveness, but as something else, something that did not follow the rules he had lived by. Whitaker looked at it, then at her, and something in his expression eased, not fully, not completely, but enough to be noticed if one was looking closely. He gave a small nod, not to her alone, but to the moment, to what had passed between them without needing to be said, and then he stepped back, turning not toward the shop, not toward the town, but toward the open land beyond, his path no longer defined by walls or counters or the weight of coins in his hand. Behind him, Eliza remained where she was, the coin and the bread resting side by side on the worn wood, simple things, easily overlooked, yet carrying a weight that neither of them would ever measure the same way again, and in that quiet, without witness, without announcement, something like justice settled into place, not loud, not claimed, but steady enough to last.